Ellen G. White's prophetic role in the early days of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is both revered and controversial. She is believed to have received more than 2,000 visions and dreams, many of which she recorded in her prolific writings. These writings became an authoritative source of spiritual guidance for Adventists and shaped key doctrines such as the sanctuary doctrine, the importance of the Sabbath, and the second coming of Christ. But what set Ellen White apart from other religious figures claiming visions was not only the volume of her prophecies, but also the clarity with which she presented them. Her prophetic experiences were not seen merely as personal revelations. They were viewed as divine communications meant for the entire church. In fact, Ellen White often emphasized that her writings were inspired by God and, as such, carried significant authority. However, with this authority came tension. Her messages were not always aligned with the more traditional, established practices within the church at the time. In several instances, Ellen White spoke out against compromise and urged the church to remain faithful to the principles she believed were divinely revealed. Her calls for purity in doctrine, unity in action, and a return to the early teachings of the Bible were direct and powerful. This sometimes put her in conflict with leaders within the church, especially as the Adventist movement grew and became more institutionalized. Ellen White's warnings to the church were not always well received. Some leaders, while publicly acknowledging her influence, sought to limit her authority or downplay certain aspects of her messages. They believed her strong stance on certain issues, such as the importance of health reform, strict adherence to the Sabbath, and the need for spiritual revival, might alienate potential converts and hinder the growth of the church. Thus, while Ellen White's role as a prophet was central to the church's identity, her authority was frequently challenged by those in leadership positions who feared that her uncompromising stance might disrupt the institution's progress. One of the most compelling aspects of Ellen White's legacy is the warning she gave regarding the direction the church might take if certain principles were ignored or compromised. In her writings, Ellen White frequently emphasized the importance of upholding the purity of the gospel and avoiding the influence of worldly systems within the church. She warned against the dangers of institutionalism and the potential for the church to lose its spiritual vitality. Her concern was not only theological, but also practical. Ellen White foresaw a time when the church would face significant challenges, including the rise of a more formalized structure that could lead to the loss of spiritual fervor. She cautioned that, in such an environment, the prophetic gifts and spiritual direction that had guided the church in its early years could be sidelined. In particular, Ellen White emphasized that the church must not allow its leaders to become overly focused on administrative duties at the expense of spiritual growth and the faithful proclamation of the gospel. She believed that if the church became too entrenched in its own organizational structure, it could lead to a blindness that would make it susceptible to false teachings, compromising the integrity of its mission. Perhaps most alarmingly, Ellen White warned about the dangers of neglecting the role of prophetic guidance in the church. She feared that the authority of the prophetic ministry would be diminished over time, as the church became more institutionally driven. In her view, this would have catastrophic consequences, as the church would be less attuned to the voice of God and less capable of discerning spiritual truth. Despite the urgency of her warnings, many within the church chose to focus on the aspects of her teachings that were more immediately palatable and less disruptive to the status quo. This led some to downplay her prophecies about the potential dangers of institutionalism, preferring instead to focus on her more optimistic messages about growth and success. However, this selective emphasis on certain aspects of her work was not without consequences, As Ellen White's influence grew, so too did the resistance to her more challenging messages. Church leaders, particularly as the Adventist movement became more established, were faced with the task of balancing the growth and institutionalization of the church with the often controversial nature of Ellen White's warnings. While they recognized her importance and the divine inspiration of her writings, they also feared that her more radical prophecies could create division or discomfort among new converts and existing members. The tension between promoting her writings and managing their potential impact became apparent in the early decades of the 20th century. Some church leaders worked to interpret her teachings in a way that would fit more comfortably within the established framework of the church. They sought to highlight her messages that aligned with the church's mission of spreading the gospel and building a global movement while downplaying her more controversial stances, particularly her warnings about institutionalism and the loss of spiritual vitality. In some cases, her more challenging messages were not so much concealed as they were marginalized. They were often relegated to lesser-known writings or portions of her books that were not as frequently referenced in public teachings. This selective approach allowed the church to maintain a certain level of control over how Ellen White's authority was presented, particularly to new members who might not have been as familiar with her more radical ideas. While some leaders may have believed that this approach was necessary for the good of the church's growth and unity, others argued that it was a betrayal of Ellen White's prophetic mission. They contended that by selectively promoting only certain aspects of her writings, the church was effectively undermining her authority and failing to heed the very warnings she had issued. This selective approach to Ellen White's teachings was not a new phenomenon. Throughout the history of the church, there has been a recurring tension between preserving the integrity of her prophetic message and the desire to maintain a stable, growing institution. In many ways, the church's response to Ellen White's warnings reflected broader challenges faced by religious organizations throughout history. The struggle between spiritual purity and institutional survival. Despite the church's efforts to manage or even conceal some of her more challenging messages, Ellen White's warnings have not been entirely lost to history. Over time, as the church has grown and evolved, her influence has continued to be felt, especially in the areas where her prophetic insights were most ahead of their time. In the modern context, the church is faced with many of the challenges Ellen White predicted: institutionalism, complacency, and a tendency to focus more on organizational success than on spiritual revival. These issues have led many Adventists to revisit her writings with a renewed sense of urgency. The warning she gave about the dangers of losing spiritual vitality in favor of institutional growth has never seemed more relevant. As the church reflects on its history and its current trajectory, it is crucial to acknowledge the complexity of Ellen White's legacy. She was a visionary who saw both the potential for greatness in the church and the dangers that could arise if the prophetic voice was silenced or ignored. Her warnings, though sometimes inconvenient for those in positions of power, continue to challenge the church to remain true to its spiritual mission and avoid the pitfalls of institutionalism. Ultimately, Ellen White's authority as a prophet cannot be easily dismissed or hidden. Her legacy is woven into the very fabric of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and her warnings continue to serve as a guiding light for those who seek to navigate the challenges of maintaining spiritual integrity in an increasingly complex world. The question remains: will the church heed her warning and ensure that its focus remains on spiritual revival, or will it succumb to the same forces of institutionalism that she cautioned against? In conclusion, Ellen G. White's prophetic warnings were not merely about doctrinal matters or the future of the Adventist movement. They were deeply concerned with the spiritual health of the church. Her call for adherence to the principles of the gospel, for avoiding the compromises of institutionalism, and for remaining faithful to the prophetic guidance of the Holy Spirit remains relevant to this day. While the Church has, at times, attempted to manage or conceal certain aspects of her teachings, the legacy of Ellen White's authority cannot be hidden. Her words continue to challenge the Church to stay true to its spiritual mission, and her warnings about the dangers of losing sight of that mission should never be ignored. As the Church moves forward, it must ask itself whether it is still listening to the prophetic voice that guided it in its early days, and whether it is heeding the warning that Ellen White so fervently delivered.